In this week's video, I'm going to be painting up this zombie horde as fast as I can by Highlands Miniatures and throwing in a couple of different techniques that I've never used before, because obviously that makes sense when you're painting up so many miniatures. Why not try something different? So I decided to try this project out just because I've been working on an undead army, and the stuff by Highlands Miniatures has been really good. They're great fun to print out and they look fantastic, and there were just about enough different zombie variations in this, especially once I started mirroring things on the print bed, that things looked interesting enough to print off a decent sized horde. So I decided to go with 40 of these zombies, which seemed like a massive undertaking, but I managed to speed paint them pretty well using pretty much just a handful of colours. Literally a couple of handfuls of colours, and then an oil wash at the end as well, which I'll go into a little bit more detail. So first up, I got them all onto their print beds. I started getting them printed out, and you can print off a decent amount of these on just one print. So using the Mars Pro, which has a relatively small print bed, I managed to print off 10 models. Now, one thing that you will want to do is probably mirror these as well partway through, otherwise you can have everything in pretty much exactly the same size. With just a couple of different sets from Highlands Miniatures, I managed to get, I think it was about 13 different model poses, including their sort of like military undead ones as well. Fortunately, I didn't have any failed prints with these, which is really handy, and they all came off the supports very nicely. Now, I'm not too fussy when it comes to zombies or undead about removing all the tiny little bits that kind of stay on there after the support's been removed, just because it looks like this stringy stuff that's just kind of on there anyway, and that you'd expect an undead horde to have. But if you do want to get them really clean, the supports come off very nicely. Just throw them in a bit of warm water, peel them off, and you are good to go. Now, I do recommend printing them off in something that isn't quite as brittle, so I've been using the Elegoo ABS-like resin, and that works perfectly for me, but whatever works for you. But I would suggest going for something that is a bit more flexible, just because these miniatures can be quite small, especially with the like kind of bony bits that are hanging off, and they can snap relatively easily if you don't do that. So once they're all printed off, that's pretty much ready to go. Just get them washed and cured, and then you're ready for priming. Now, I will say the one downside of these is they aren't modular, but at the end of the day, there's a decent enough amount of poses here that I wasn't too concerned about that. However, if you wanted to go any bigger, it would have been nice to see some modularity from these, but again, they were some of the best zombie poses that I could find out there. So let me know in the comments, have you got another set of zombies that I can maybe go off and look at, and I'll get those printed off and try them out as well, because I'll definitely be wanting to expand this horde in the future. So with my test batch, my first 20, I did a Xenophil Prime, and on my second batch, I chose not to, which was a big mistake. It's definitely worthwhile going for that, especially when you're speed painting. It takes a little bit longer to obviously to get them primed up, but it is well and truly worth it, and it just saves a little bit of time later on. Once everything was primed, I basically stuck with a couple of colours. So the first ones are for the skin, to kind of give them something a little bit different. I went with Guilliman Flesh for about half of them, and Plague Bearer's Flesh for the other half. Now, I found that this allowed me to kind of mix and match things, so I went for different contrasting colours for the clothing against Guilliman Flesh, and then contrasting colours for the Plague Bearer's Flesh. And both sets of those came out really nicely and just helped to keep things a little bit varied. Now, as you'll see from my painting technique here, there's not much to it. It's literally just load up your brush, start slapping it on, and you don't have to be too worried about making mistakes with this. Now, normally if it was maybe a different type of miniature, you'd probably want to paint a little bit more carefully than what you can see I'm doing here. But the great thing about this is, later on when we do the oil wash, it'll cover up a lot of those mistakes. And to be honest, they're zombies, so you don't need to be overly careful with these. So moving on from the flesh, I stuck with some relatively neutral colours, to be fair. So one of the favourite ones was Militarum Green, so I used this on a lot of the clothing, and also a Nazdreg Yellow. It kind of gave this really light, leathery look, which was really handy. I also used Snakebite Leather as well. As you can see, this is going down on some of the clothing. And then for any of the sort of weapon wood, I used Wildwood, and that came out really nicely. For the metallics, I didn't actually use any metallic paint. I just went with Basilicanum Grey, and to be honest, it looks good enough. It looks like a worn down metal that's been kind of dug up out of the ground along with these zombies. I wasn't too worried about kind of having this nice shiny metal. It didn't take me too long to get all of those colours down, and again, as you can see from this overhead camera here, I am just slapping the paint on. I'm trying to keep it relatively tidy because I don't want to have all sorts of different colours overlapping onto the flesh and ruining that work, but at the end of the day, you don't have to kind of get into every single nook and cranny. I did find it more tedious on the ones that I didn't Xenophil Prime, because then I had to kind of get into bits that had more white and everything, but again, that oil paint wash that we're going to be doing later on is going to cover up a lot of those mistakes, or any of the places that you've missed, so don't worry too much about it. Once the initial base was down with these contrast paints, it was done really quickly. Everything was looking pretty good, but they do look a little bit, obviously, I guess washed out and maybe a bit cartoony at this point, but that's going to be sold very shortly with the oil wash. As I got onto my second set as well, I did throw in some other colours as well, so some blues and reds, just to help to differentiate things because it was starting to look a bit samey when I was getting to that stage. For hair, use whatever colours you want, and I will say one thing that I kind of wish that I did is that I would have rather maybe gone for some lighter colours at this stage, especially when it comes to things like the wood, because that oil wash obviously is going to be much darker and it would make things pop a lot more if I'd used a lighter base. But again, experiment and see what works for you. So that's the initial colours all done, and I've got to say I love contrast paints for this sort of thing. It lets me get these sort of models knocked out really quickly, and they look pretty good with relatively minimal effort, or I guess talent as well, so that's always a bonus for someone like me. So now we move on to the oil wash, and I've never done this before, but I have seen some videos about it. There's a really good one by Ninjon, and I definitely recommend going over there and having a look. I wasn't as experimental as he was, where he did some sort of like purple shading to give them a really almost like a magical effect, but I just went for pure, boring black, but I think it came out pretty good. Now with the oil wash, less is more when it comes to the actual oil paint going into your palette. So put a very small amount and then halve that amount because you're probably putting too much in there. Every single time I made up one of these oil washes, it always had too much paint and I had to keep on adding more and more spirits. Now I'm going to have all the bits linked down below in the description, so if you do want to check out any of those supplies, go ahead, have a look and see what I've been using. But it's basically pretty simple. You put in some oil paint, mix it in with some spirits, and then you keep mixing it until you get it to the consistency that you like. Now I will say I preferred a thicker wash when it came with these, so I experimented a little bit and I used a really thin wash, and that acted more like a traditional wash that you probably used in the past. However, I like the thick wash, and as you can see, it's getting slapped on really thick here, and they look like some kind of tar zombies that have just pulled themselves out of some prehistoric pit. But don't worry, you aren't ruining your work when we get to the next stage. They look really good by going for this thicker wash. I also didn't do any varnishing beforehand, so some people do suggest using something like a satin varnish, and that'll help it kind of run into different places. I can completely understand that for maybe some types of models, but we're not going to leave these for too long to let that oil paint settle dry or anything like that, so I didn't have to worry about it. Or at least in my head, I didn't have to worry about it. Guess we'll find out. So once they were all slapped up and covered in this tar-like substance, you go back in with a little makeup sponge. Now you can get these really cheap from somewhere like eBay or Amazon. You don't need to spend a fortune, and then you just go off to the model and start cleaning it up. As you can see in this, all I'm doing is wiping off a lot of those top surfaces, and it leaves a lot of that sort of like black tar staining in around like the arms and everything else. It adds some fantastic shadows, a lot of blacks and everything else as well, and best of all, it covers up any of those places that you've missed. So anything where you haven't zenithal primed or you just haven't been able to get your brush in there, the oil comes into your rescue. Honestly, when I first did this, I looked and I was like, I've basically ruined these models. That is far too thick. It's going to be absolutely awful. But when I got to the wiping it off stage, it started to look so good. In my opinion, the blending between it just looks so much more professional than anything else that I would personally be able to achieve. You might be different, but it's a really quick, nice way to get those shadows in, but blend them relatively subtly from the really dark stages through to, like, I guess the lighter places. On the zombie flesh, it just looks fantastic. Helps to smooth out some of those tide marks that have been left by the contrast paints, and I think this looks fantastic once it's done. It's definitely worthwhile experimenting with, and if you want me to do another video, maybe trying out some different colours and how all of that looks against different paints and figures and everything else, let me know in the comments and I'll see what I can do. Thankfully, I didn't rub off any of the paint either, so I didn't need to worry too much about that, and it looks like my no varnishing actually paid off, so I'm pretty happy with that. You might be wondering how long I left it for to set. Some people say leave it 2 to 3 hours, some people say overnight. Now, I left it literally, I kind of started slapping it on there, and once I got to the last zombie, I moved right back to the original one and started wiping it off. Now, obviously, this is the first time I've been doing this, so I don't have that much experience from it. But what I tended to find was if you could see a lot more, I guess, wetness to it, then it's probably too soon, and your makeup sponge is going to pull out a lot of that oil paint from the recesses where you want to keep it. So wait until that wetness is starting to disappear and then go to work with your makeup sponge. If you do want to go back in at a later time, you can reactivate it as well by using some of that mineral spirits. So literally dab a bit onto your makeup sponge, go back in there and maybe do a bit more cleaning up. What I tended to find was I did a very quick initial rub off. That sounds absolutely awful. What I found worked for me was going through all of the models, wiping off the oil, and then going back in with a clean sponge and just doing some of the highlight areas and just making sure that some of those colours popped. So once that was done, I based them, and although it's not the best basing in the world because that was absolutely tedious and I was already pulling what was left of my hair out, I've got to say I think these look pretty fantastic. It took me far less time than I expected. Once I actually printed all of these off and started priming, I really regretted trying this because it looked like it was going to take so much longer than it actually did. But with a combination of using contrast paint and then using that oil wash and trying that out for the first time, it was actually a much smoother and faster process than I expected. So it's definitely one worthwhile trying out if you're going to be doing these sort of models. Now I've just got a set of like Skaven type models as well, and I'm looking to maybe do a similar thing as well. So let me know again in the comments if you'd like to see that in the future, because I'm really excited for that one. So that's it. That's how to paint up your zombie horde relatively quickly using contrast paint and also an oil wash. I think these by Highlands Miniatures look fantastic, and once you've got that paint on there, they look even better. And I am really happy with how this zombie horde's turned out. So without further ado, let's kick over and do the grand reveal so you can see what these all look like in their monstrous horde. But before we do that, hit the like and subscribe button because it just helps the channel to grow. I'll be back in the future with some more 3D printing and painting content. Over to the zombies.